Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Answers. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe you've had one of those days where your mind just won't stop spinning, or maybe you're someone who likes falling asleep to deep questions and philosophical mysteries rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. You've got nothing to do but rest. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing slow, and your thoughts drift like clouds across a quiet sky. Because tonight, we're exploring something closer to you than anything else in the universe, yet somehow more mysterious than the furthest reaches of space. We're diving into consciousness itself, that strange inner light that makes you, you. What is it that makes you aware right now? What creates the feeling of being someone, of experiencing the world from inside your own head? Scientists can map every neuron. Philosophers can debate every angle. But consciousness remains the greatest puzzle we've ever encountered. It's the mystery inside your head, the secret theater where all your experiences play out. And tonight, we'll wander through its many rooms together. Before we begin, if these calm explorations into life's deepest questions help you unwind or give you something interesting to ponder as you drift off, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too, one curious mind at a time. Now, let's step into the mystery. Consciousness is the most familiar thing in the world and the hardest to explain. Right now, you're experiencing something. You're aware of these words, perhaps aware of the room around you, the weight of your body against the bed, the sound of your own breathing. There's a quality to all of this, a sense of what it's like to be you in this moment. That's consciousness. But what is it, really? When we try to define consciousness, we immediately run into a problem. Unlike objects in the physical world, which we can point to and measure and agree upon, consciousness seems to exist only from the inside. It's fundamentally subjective, private, accessible only to the person experiencing it. You know what it's like to see the color red, to feel happiness, to taste chocolate, but you can never directly know what those experiences are like for anyone else. You can't step into another person's consciousness and look around. Philosophers and scientists often talk about consciousness as having a phenomenal quality, sometimes called qualia. This intimidating term simply refers to the subjective, qualitative aspects of our experiences. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the particular taste of coffee on a sleepy morning. These qualities seem obvious and undeniable when you're experiencing them, yet they're impossible to fully convey to someone else or to capture in purely physical terms. Think about it this way. Imagine trying to explain the color blue to someone who has been blind from birth. You could describe the wavelength of light about 450 nanometers. You could explain how cone cells in the retina respond, how signals travel through the optic nerve to the visual cortex. You could be exhaustively accurate about the physics and biology involved. But would any of that capture what blue actually looks like? That subjective quality of blueness that makes the sky on a clear day feel the way it does? There seems to be something left over, something that escapes the purely physical description. This is consciousness in a nutshell. It's awareness, yes, but it's more than that. It's the felt quality of awareness, the inner light of experience that illuminates your world from within. When neuroscientists study the brain, they can identify which areas light up when you see blue, which chemicals are released when you feel joy, which patterns of firing correlate with different states of awareness. But none of that quite seems to explain the experience itself, the irreducible fact that there's something it is like to be you. The phrase, something it's like, comes from philosopher Thomas Nagel, who wrote a famous paper in 1974 called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Nagel pointed out that while we can study bat brains and bat behavior all we want, we can never really know what it's like to experience the world through echolocation, to perceive your surroundings through reflected sound waves rather than light. There's an experiential gap we can't cross. And that gap, Nagel argued, reveals something fundamental about consciousness. It has an intrinsic first-person character that can't be fully captured from the outside, from the third-person perspective of science. This leads us to different types or levels of consciousness that researchers distinguish. There's what's called creature consciousness, the basic fact of being awake and aware rather than unconscious or asleep. There is access consciousness, having information available for use in reasoning and guiding behavior. And then there's phenomenal consciousness, that subjective, experiential quality we've been discussing, the what it's like aspect of being aware. A simple example helps clarify the distinction. Imagine you're driving home on a familiar route while lost in thought. You successfully navigate traffic lights, turns, and other cars, your access consciousness processing information and guiding your behavior. But your attention is elsewhere, on a conversation you had earlier or plans for tomorrow. Later, you might not remember the drive at all. The information was accessed and used, but perhaps without the full phenomenal richness of conscious experience. Or perhaps it was there, just not encoded into memory. These distinctions get murky quickly, which is part of what makes consciousness so difficult to study. There's also the matter of self-consciousness, which is awareness of oneself as a distinct entity with a continuous existence through time. This seems to be a higher level of consciousness that may not be present in all conscious creatures. A dog is surely conscious in the sense of having experiences, feeling pain and pleasure, seeing and smelling the world. But does a dog have a concept of itself as a self, extended through time, with a past and future? That's a harder question. And what about simpler animals, insects, or even plants responding to their environment? Where does consciousness begin and end in the natural world? These questions don't have clear answers yet, and that's part of what makes tonight's exploration so fascinating. Consciousness exists on a spectrum, from the simple awareness of a bacterium orienting toward nutrients, if we can even call that awareness, all the way up to human self-reflection and the ability to ponder consciousness itself. We're trying to understand something that we can only approach from within the very phenomenon we're studying. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, or asking water to explain wetness. And yet for all its mysteriousness, consciousness is also utterly ordinary. It's what you're doing right now, effortlessly and continuously. You didn't need to study philosophy or neuroscience to be conscious. It's the most natural thing in the world, happening every moment you're awake, perhaps even as you dream. Consciousness is both the closest thing to you and the furthest from understanding. It's the stage on which your entire life unfolds. Yet we don't know how the stage is built or why there's a stage at all. So, as you settle deeper into comfort tonight, remember that you're not just a body lying in bed. You're a center of experience, a point of view on the universe, a stream of awareness flowing through time. And, while science hasn't yet solved the mystery of how this happens, how mere matter gives rise to inner experience, the fact that it does happen, that you exist as a conscious being, is perhaps the most remarkable fact in all of existence. Now, let's go deeper into the problem itself. The famous hard problem that has philosophers and scientists scratching their heads even as they map the brain in ever finer detail. In the mid-1990s, philosopher David Chalmers made a distinction that would shape the study of consciousness for decades to come. He divided the questions we might ask about consciousness into two categories: the easy problems and the hard problem. Despite the labels, none of these problems are actually easy, but some are easier than others, more amenable to the standard methods of science. The easy problems, Chalmers explained, are those that can in principle be solved by figuring out the underlying mechanisms. How does the brain integrate information from different senses into a unified experience? How does it distinguish between self and environment? How does it control attention, focus on some things while filtering out others? How does it store and retrieve memories? How does sleep differ from wakefulness in terms of brain activity? These are all difficult questions, requiring sophisticated neuroscience and careful experimentation. But they're the kind of questions science knows how to approach. You can break them down into smaller parts, study the relevant brain regions, trace the flow of information, build computational models, and gradually work toward explanations. The hard problem, on the other hand, is different in kind. The hard problem is this: why is all of this physical processing accompanied by experience at all? Why doesn't it all happen in the dark, so to speak, with information being processed, decisions being made, behaviors being executed, but no inner light of awareness illuminating any of it? Why is there something it's like to see red, rather than just the discrimination of wavelengths happening unconsciously? Why do pains hurt, in that specific phenomenal way, rather than just triggering avoidance behavior without any feeling? This is the explanatory gap that seems to yawn open when we try to connect brain states to conscious experiences. We can describe in exquisite detail what happens in your brain when you see red. Photons hit your retina. Certain cone cells respond. Signals travel along the optic nerve. Specific patterns of neural firing occur in the visual cortex. Information gets integrated across multiple brain regions. All of that can be measured, mapped, and explained. But then there's the experience of redness itself, that particular subjective quality. And no amount of information about neurons and firing patterns seems to quite explain why that physical process feels like something, why it has a phenomenal character. Chalmers illustrated this with thought experiments, the most famous being the philosophical zombie. Imagine a being that is physically and functionally identical to a human in every way. It has a brain just like yours, processes information just like you do, responds to stimuli, speaks intelligently about its experiences, behaves exactly as a conscious person would. But inside, there's nothing, no lights on, no experience happening. It's a zombie in the philosopher's sense, not the Hollywood flesh-eating variety, but rather a being that lacks consciousness, despite having all the physical and behavioral properties of a conscious being. Now, Chalmers isn't arguing that such zombies actually exist. The point is that we can conceive of them without logical contradiction. And if we can coherently imagine a world where all the physical facts are the same, but consciousness is absent, then consciousness must be something over and above the physical facts. It can't be fully explained just by describing brain processes, because you could have all those processes without the experience. That's the hard problem in a nutshell. Another famous thought experiment is Mary's room, originally proposed by philosopher Frank Jackson. Mary is a brilliant scientist who knows everything there is to know about the physics of color. She's spent her entire life in a black and white room, learning about wavelengths, about how the eye works, about neural processing of color information. She knows every physical fact about color. Then one day she steps outside and sees a red rose for the first time. Does she learn something new? It seems like she must. She learns what red looks like, the actual experience of redness, which is different from all the facts she already knew. And if she learns something new despite knowing all the physical facts, then there must be facts about consciousness, facts about experience, that aren't captured by physical descriptions. Critics have argued against these thought experiments in various ways. Some say we can't really conceive of zombies coherently, that when we imagine them, we're sneaking in some assumption that contradicts the setup. Others argue that Mary doesn't actually learn a new fact, but rather gains a new ability or a new way of knowing the same facts she already knew. The debates get intricate and technical, but the intuition behind the heart problem remains powerful. There seems to be an explanatory gap between the objective, physical processes we can measure and the subjective experiences we actually have. This gap is sometimes described in terms of qualia, those qualitative, subjective aspects of experience. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of mint, the sound of a violin. Qualia seem to resist physical explanation in a way that other phenomena don't. We can explain lightning by describing electrical discharge, and once we've done that, there's no lingering mystery about what lightning really is. But even after we've fully explained the neural mechanisms of pain, there still seems to be something left to explain. Why it hurts, what that specific feeling is like from the inside. Some philosophers and scientists think the heart problem is, well, not a real problem, or at least not as hard as Chalmers makes it out to be. They argue that once we fully solve the easy problems, once we completely understand the mechanisms of information processing and integration, once we can explain how the brain creates models of the world and of itself, the heart problem will simply dissolve. Consciousness will turn out to be nothing over and above these functional processes, and our intuition that there's something more will be revealed as a kind of cognitive illusion. Daniel Dennett, a prominent philosopher who takes this view, has argued that our concept of qualia is confused from the start. He thinks that when we carefully examine what we're actually able to report and think about our experiences, we find that it's all information about relationships and reactions, not some ineffable inner essence. The seeming mysteriousness of consciousness, in Dennett's view, comes from our tendency to think there's more to explain than there actually is. It's like asking why a magician's trick is magical after you've learned all the mechanics of how it's done. There's no remaining mystery, just our lingering intuition that there should be one. But others, including Chalmers and many researchers, maintain that even if we solve all the functional questions, even if we can predict and explain every aspect of behavior and information processing, we'll still face the question of why any of that is accompanied by experience. The zombie thought experiment suggests that you could have all the functions without the feeling, and if that's true, then explaining the functions doesn't explain the feeling. The hard problem remains hard. What makes this especially puzzling is that consciousness seems to be produced by the brain, a physical organ made of neurons and chemicals and electrical signals. There's overwhelming evidence that conscious experiences depend on brain activity. Damage certain areas of the brain, and you lose certain aspects of consciousness. Anesthesia alters brain chemistry and eliminates consciousness temporarily. Brain states correlate reliably with experiential states. And yet, we don't understand how this works. How do electrochemical signals in neurons give rise to the felt quality of seeing blue or feeling sad? How does matter become aware of itself? This is sometimes called the mind-body problem, an ancient philosophical puzzle that has taken on new urgency in the age of neuroscience. Are mind and body two different things, as Descartes famously proposed? Or are they ultimately one, with consciousness being nothing more than a certain kind of physical process? Dualism, the view that mind and matter are distinct, faces the challenge of explaining how they interact. If consciousness isn't physical, how does it affect the physical brain and body? How do mental events cause physical events? The problem seems intractable. But materialism, the view that everything is physical, faces its own challenge, which is precisely the hard problem. If consciousness is just brain activity, why does it feel like something? Why isn't it just information processing in the dark? The explanatory gap remains stubbornly open. Some researchers have proposed that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of the universe, like mass or charge, something that can't be reduced to anything simpler. Just as physics takes certain properties as basic and builds theories around them, perhaps a science of consciousness will need to take experience itself as fundamental. Chalmers has explored this possibility, suggesting that there might be psychophysical laws, basic principles connecting physical states to conscious states in a systematic way. Others think the solution will come from better understanding of how information is integrated and processed in complex systems. Consciousness, in this view, isn't something separate from physical processing, but it's a special kind of processing, perhaps involving feedback loops, self-monitoring, or certain patterns of neural integration that create the unified field of awareness. The hard problem, whether you think it's truly hard or eventually solvable, forces us to confront something deep about our place in the universe. We're physical beings, made of atoms and molecules, subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. And yet, we're also experiencing subjects, centers of awareness with rich inner lives. Somehow, these two descriptions have to fit together. Somehow, the objective world studied by science has to make room for the subjective world of consciousness. and figuring out how they connect remains one of the deepest challenges in all of human inquiry. As you rest tonight, you might find it strange to think that your own awareness, so immediate and obvious, is such a profound mystery. But maybe that makes it all the more wondrous. You're not just lying in bed, you're participating in one of the universe's greatest puzzles, simply by being awake enough to hear these words before sleep takes you away. So, what does science tell us about the brain and consciousness? While we might not have solved the hard problem, neuroscience has made remarkable progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness, the brain activity that goes along with different conscious states and experiences. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each one a tiny cell that communicates with thousands of others through electrical and chemical signals. These neurons form intricate networks, with information flowing in complex patterns across different regions. When you're conscious, your brain is a storm of activity, with billions of signals being sent every second. Patterns forming and dissolving, information being integrated and transformed in ways we're only beginning to understand. One of the fundamental discoveries is that consciousness isn't located in a single place in the brain. There's no consciousness center, no one region where awareness happens. Instead, consciousness seems to emerge from the coordinated activity of multiple brain areas working together. This makes sense when you think about the richness of conscious experience. At any moment, you're aware of sights, sounds, thoughts, memories, emotions, bodily sensations, all woven together into a unified field of experience. That unity requires integration across many specialized systems. The cerebral cortex, the wrinkled outer layer of the brain, plays a central role. The cortex is divided into different regions that handle different functions. The visual cortex at the back of your head processes visual information. The auditory cortex handles sound. The somatosensory cortex deals with touch and bodily sensation, and the frontal cortex is involved in planning, decision-making, and self-control. When these areas are active and communicating with each other, consciousness is rich and detailed. When their activity is disrupted, as in deep sleep or under anesthesia, consciousness fades or disappears. Deeper brain structures also contribute in fascinating and essential ways. The thalamus, a walnut-sized structure in the center of the brain, acts as a relay station, channeling sensory information to the cortex and coordinating activity across different regions. Think of it as a switchboard operator, routing signals to their proper destinations and helping synchronize the activity of far-flung cortical areas. Damage to the thalamus can severely impair consciousness, suggesting it plays a crucial role in maintaining the integrated activity that supports awareness. Patients with thalamic damage often show profound alterations in consciousness, sometimes falling into persistent vegetative states, despite having relatively intact cortical tissue. The brainstem, even more ancient in evolutionary terms, controls basic functions like breathing and heart rate. But it also contains systems that regulate arousal and wakefulness. Deep within the brainstem lies the reticular activating system, a network of neurons that essentially controls your level of alertness. When these neurons are firing vigorously, you're awake and alert. When their activity decreases, you become drowsy and eventually fall asleep. Damage to this system can produce coma, a state of complete unconsciousness from which the person cannot be awakened. You can't be conscious without being awake, and wakefulness depends on these deep, primitive structures that evolved hundreds of millions of years ago. Other subcortical structures contribute their own pieces to the puzzle. The basal ganglia, involved in movement and habit formation, also seem to play a role in conscious awareness, particularly in the feeling of agency, that sense that you're the one initiating your actions. The hippocampus and surrounding medial temporal lobe structures are crucial for forming new conscious memories. You can be conscious without forming new memories, as demonstrated by patients with damage to these areas who live in an eternal present, conscious but unable to record new experiences. But the connection between consciousness and memory is intimate. Most of what we call our conscious experience depends on memory, on connecting this moment to the past and projecting into the future. The claustrum, a thin sheet of neurons hidden deep beneath the cortex, has been suggested by some researchers as a possible integration center for consciousness, though this remains speculative. What's clear is that consciousness doesn't arise from any single structure, but from the coordinated activity of many regions, each contributing different aspects to the unified field of awareness you experience. One striking feature of the brain that relates to consciousness is the sheer amount of feedback. Signals traveling not just from sensory organs to higher processing areas, but back down again, with higher areas influencing and modulating what lower areas are doing. This feedback seems to be crucial for conscious experience. In the visual system, for example, there are more connections going from higher visual areas back to lower ones than there are going forward. The brain isn't just passively receiving information from the world. It's actively constructing experience, using expectations and predictions to interpret incoming signals. This leads to what's called the binding problem. When you look at a red ball, your brain processes its color in one area, its shape in another, its motion in yet another. But you don't experience these as separate features. You experience a unified object, a red ball moving across your field of vision. How does the brain bind these separate pieces of information together into a single conscious experience? Nobody knows for sure, but it likely involves synchronized activity across different areas. Neurons firing in coordinated rhythms that link together the different features of an object. Studies using brain imaging techniques like functional MRI and electroencephalography, or EEG, have revealed fascinating patterns associated with consciousness. When you're consciously aware of something, there tends to be widespread, synchronized activity across many brain regions. When you're not conscious of something, even though your brain is still processing it, the activity is more localized and less coordinated. This suggests that consciousness involves a kind of global broadcasting of information, making it available across different systems rather than being confined to a specialized module. One influential framework, called global workspace theory, developed by cognitive scientist Bernard Bars, proposes that consciousness is like a spotlight on a stage. At any moment, countless processes are happening unconsciously in the brain, like actors preparing backstage. But only a small amount of information enters the global workspace, the bright spotlight of consciousness, where it becomes available to many different systems and can be used for reasoning, speaking, and decision-making. What makes something conscious in this view is that it's been selected to enter this global workspace and broadcast widely. Another theory, called integrated information theory, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, takes a different approach. It tries to characterize consciousness in terms of the amount and quality of integrated information a system possesses. A system is conscious to the degree that it integrates information in an irreducible way, meaning the whole is more than the sum of its parts. The theory even proposes a mathematical measure, phi, for quantifying consciousness. A system with high phi, lots of integrated information, would be highly conscious. A system with low phi, where parts operate independently, would have little or no consciousness. These theories make testable predictions and have generated considerable research, but they also have limitations and critics. Global workspace theory explains some aspects of conscious access, but may not fully address the hard problem of why there's experience at all. Integrated information theory is ambitious in trying to quantify consciousness, but some argue its definitions are unclear and its predictions counterintuitive, like suggesting that certain simple systems could be conscious if they integrate enough information. Higher-order theories take yet another angle, proposing that what makes a mental state conscious is that you're aware of being in that state. Consciousness involves a kind of self-monitoring, mental states becoming objects of other mental states. You don't just see red, you're aware that you're seeing red. This meta-awareness, this higher-order representation, is what makes the experience conscious rather than unconscious. Critics point out that this seems to make consciousness too cognitive, too dependent on language and thought, when even young children and animals seem to have rich conscious experiences without necessarily being self-aware in this reflective sense. More recently, predictive processing theories have gained traction. These propose that the brain is constantly generating predictions about sensory input based on past experience and current context. Consciousness, in this framework, might be related to the precision and integration of these predictions, the brain's best guess about what's happening, both in the world and in the body. When predictions are violated, when something unexpected happens, there's an error signal that updates the model. The richness and detail of these predictions and the way they're integrated might be what gives rise to conscious experience. But for all these theories and all the progress in mapping brain activity, the hard problem lurks in the background. We can identify which brain regions are active during different experiences. We can show that certain patterns of neural firing correlate with certain contents of consciousness. We can even predict what someone is experiencing based on their brain activity in some cases. But we still don't have a satisfying explanation for why any of this neural activity produces experience in the first place. The correlation between brain states and conscious states is clear. The explanation for why that correlation exists remains elusive. Part of the difficulty is that neuroscience typically works by breaking things down into parts and explaining the whole in terms of how the parts interact. That works wonderfully for many biological phenomena. We can explain digestion by studying the organs involved, the chemical reactions, the muscles that move food through the system. But consciousness might not yield to this approach. It might be that the unity of conscious experience, the way everything comes together into a single stream of awareness, is essential to what consciousness is, and that unity might be lost when you try to break it into parts. There's also the question of whether we're even asking the right questions. Maybe the conceptual framework we're using, talking about physical processes and subjective experiences as two different things that need to be connected, is itself the problem. Maybe a truly deep understanding of consciousness will require rethinking our basic concepts, developing new ways of thinking that dissolve the apparent gap between matter and mind. For now, neuroscience continues to map the brain in ever finer detail, identifying more and more of the neural machinery involved in consciousness. Each discovery is fascinating in its own right. We learn how memories are stored, how emotions are generated, how attention is controlled, how the sense of self emerges from brain activity. These are genuine achievements. But the ultimate question, how and why all of this becomes experience, remains as mysterious as ever. The brain, 3 pounds of tissue that somehow lights up with awareness, guards its deepest secret still. As you drift further into relaxation, your own brain is shifting gears, moving from the focused wakefulness of consciousness toward the different state of sleep. Soon, neural activity will reorganize, conscious awareness will fade, and dreams might emerge. Another strange state where your brain creates experiences without direct input from the world. Even in sleep, the mystery continues. Let's turn now to the mystery of subjective experience itself, that inner quality that makes your experiences yours, that gives consciousness its peculiar first-person character. Imagine you've never tasted chocolate. You can learn all about it, study the chemical compounds, the ways it's made, the effects it has on the brain when consumed. You can read descriptions from people who have tasted it. Sweet, rich, smooth, slightly bitter. But until you actually taste chocolate yourself, there's something you don't know. You don't know what chocolate tastes like. That ineffable quality, the actual experience of tasting chocolate, can't be conveyed through any amount of factual information. You have to experience it directly. This is what philosophers mean by qualia, the intrinsic, subjective qualities of experience. Qualia are what make your experiences feel like something from the inside. The redness of red, the smell of roses, the ache of sadness, the sound of laughter. These aren't just abstract concepts or physical processes. They're felt qualities, vivid and immediate, present in the theater of your consciousness. And here's what makes qualia so puzzling. They seem to be private, accessible only to you. You can describe your experience to someone else, but you can never share it directly. You can never know for certain whether the red you see looks the same as the red someone else sees. Maybe what you call red and what I call red produce totally different subjective experiences, but we've both learned to call the same objects red, so we never realize our experiences differ. This is called the inverted spectrum hypothesis, and while it seems impossible to test, it highlights the private nature of qualia. Some philosophers have argued that qualia don't really exist, or at least not in the way we think they do. They're skeptical of this idea of an inner subjective essence that can't be captured by physical or functional descriptions. When you examine your experiences carefully, they argue, you find relationships and reactions, not some mysterious inner glow. The redness of red is nothing more than your brain's way of categorizing certain wavelengths of light and your learned associations with that category. This feeling of pain is your body's alarm system, triggering avoidance behavior and emotional reactions. Strip away the functions, the behaviors, the information processing, and there's nothing left. Qualia, in this view, are a philosophical invention, not a real feature of consciousness. But to many people, including many researchers, this seems to miss something essential. When you're in pain, the actual feeling of pain is not the same as the various things pain causes you to do or think. The painfulness, the specific unpleasant quality of the experience, seems real and undeniable. It's what makes pain matter to you. A being that detected tissue damage and triggered appropriate responses but didn't actually feel anything wouldn't really be in pain in the way you are when you stub your toe. The subjective feeling is central, not peripheral. This brings us back to thought experiments like Mary's room. Mary, if you recall, knows all the physical facts about color, but has never experienced color. When she finally sees red, she learns something new. She learns what red looks like. Now, physicalists argue that she doesn't actually learn a new fact, but rather gains a new ability, the ability to imagine red, or to recognize it on sight. Or perhaps she gains the same information she already had, but now knows it in a different way, experientially rather than abstractly. These are attempts to preserve the idea that physical facts are all the facts, that there's nothing about consciousness that escapes physical description. But the intuition that Mary learned something genuinely new is strong. And if there's knowledge about experience that you can only gain through having the experience, knowledge that all the physical facts don't give you, then it seems like consciousness involves something beyond the physical. This is why the Mary thought experiment has been so influential and so debated. It seems to show that qualia, subjective experiences, can't be fully explained in terms of objective, physical facts. Another famous thought experiment is the philosophical zombie we mentioned earlier, but it's worth revisiting in the context of qualia. The zombie is functionally identical to a conscious person but has no qualia, no inner experiences. It responds to stimuli, processes information, speaks about its experiences, all without anything actually feeling like anything from the inside. If such a being is conceivable, then qualia must be something separate from function and behavior. They're an extra ingredient, not reducible to physical processes. Critics argue that zombies aren't actually conceivable, or at least not coherently. When you try to imagine a zombie in detail, imagining all the information processing, all the behavior, eventually you might realize that there's nothing left to be absent. The zombie would be conscious, because consciousness just is the right kind of information processing and behavior. The seeming conceivability of zombies trades on our intuitions, which might mislead us. Just because you can say the words doesn't mean the concept makes sense. The debates go back and forth, technical and sometimes frustrating, because intuitions pull in different directions. But underlying all of it is this central mystery. You have experiences. They feel like something. That felt quality seems to be a real, important aspect of what's happening when you're conscious. And yet, we don't know how to fit it into our scientific understanding of the world. We don't know how neurons firing in patterns give rise to the taste of mint, or the color purple, or the emotion of nostalgia. Some philosophers, like Thomas Nagel, have emphasized that consciousness has a fundamentally subjective character that can't be fully captured by objective descriptions. Science works by trying to develop objective theories, frameworks that describe the world from no particular point of view, in terms that anyone can verify. But consciousness is essentially perspectival, defined by a particular point of view. There is something it's like to be you, but not from the outside, only from the inside. This subjectivity might be irreducible, not something that can be translated into purely objective terms without losing what's essential. If that's true, it has profound implications. It might mean that consciousness can never be fully explained by the methods of science, at least not science as currently practiced. Or it might mean we need to expand our conception of science, making room for first-person data, for subjective reports, treated as just as real and important as objective measurements. Some researchers are trying to do exactly that, developing rigorous methods for studying experience from the inside, through careful introspection and phenomenological description. The mystery of qualia also raises questions about artificial intelligence. If we build a machine that processes information like a brain, that responds to its environment intelligently, that passes every behavioral test for consciousness, would it actually have qualia? Would there be something it's like to be that machine? Or would it be a zombie, functioning without feeling? We can't answer that question without understanding what qualia are and what gives rise to them. And until we do, we can't be sure whether we're creating conscious beings or just very sophisticated automatons. As you lie there, each sensation you're experiencing, the softness of your pillow, the temperature of the air, the sound of silence or distant noise, these are qualia. They're the contents of your consciousness, the stuff experience is made of. They seem utterly real as anything. And yet, they're also utterly mysterious. Philosophy and science have been grappling with them for centuries, and we're still not sure exactly what they are or how they arise. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, at least for a while longer. What matters, perhaps, is not that we solve every puzzle, but that we appreciate the wonder of it all. You're a being capable of experience, and that's extraordinary, even if we can't fully explain it. The universe has given rise to creatures like you, who can ponder their own existence, feel joy and sorrow, see beauty, and ask questions about what it all means. That is something worth marveling at as you drift toward sleep. Now, let's explore what consciousness looks like across the natural world, in other animals, and perhaps even simpler forms of life. When you look into the eyes of a dog or cat, it's hard not to feel that someone is looking back. Animals clearly have experiences. They feel pain, seek pleasure, show fear and affection, respond to their environment in ways that seem to reflect awareness. But how much of what we call consciousness do they possess? And where in the animal kingdom does consciousness begin? These questions are both fascinating and difficult. We can't ask animals about their experiences, and we have to infer their mental states from behavior, brain structure, and evolutionary considerations. With mammals, especially those closely related to us like primates, the case for consciousness is strong. They have similar brain structures, similar behaviors, similar ways of processing information. A chimpanzee almost certainly has conscious experiences, rich and complex, perhaps not so different from our own in fundamental ways. They recognize themselves in mirrors, showing self-awareness. They display emotions that look remarkably like human emotions, mourning their dead, showing empathy toward others, forming complex social relationships. They solve problems, use tools, even engage in what looks like deception, suggesting they model other minds and anticipate others' thoughts. There's someone there, a subjective perspective on the world, a chimpanzee's view of reality that has its own unique character. But consciousness isn't limited to our closest relatives. Elephants display remarkable cognitive abilities and emotional depth. They recognize themselves in mirrors, too, one of only a handful of species to pass this test of self-awareness. They show what appears to be grief when a member of their head dies, returning to the bones of deceased elephants and touching them gently with their trunks. They help injured members of their group work together to solve problems and remember locations and individuals across years or even decades. An elephant's consciousness, if we could experience it, might be dominated by smell in ways we can barely imagine, their sense of smell being far more acute than ours, and by the infrasonic rumbles they use to communicate across miles, sounds too low for humans to hear, but which form a rich layer of their social world. Dolphins and whales, the cetaceans, are another fascinating case. They have large, complex brains with elaborate folding in the cortex, suggesting sophisticated information processing. They communicate with each other using complex vocalizations, with some species appearing to have signature whistles, like names, for individual dolphins. They display playful behavior, seem to show empathy, and can learn and follow complex instructions. Some researchers believe they may have a different kind of consciousness than land mammals, shaped by their three-dimensional oceanic environment and their reliance on echolocation. What would it be like to perceive the world primarily through sound, through the echoes of your own clicks bouncing off objects and prey in the dark water? We can barely imagine it, yet that may be the reality of dolphin consciousness, as rich and real as our own, but utterly different in character. As you move further away from humans evolutionarily, the picture gets murkier. Birds have very different brains from mammals, yet they display remarkable cognitive abilities. Crows can use tools, solve multi-step problems, and even seem to hold grudges. Parrots, like African greys, understand concepts and use language in sophisticated ways. These birds are clearly intelligent and seem to have mental lives that include something like conscious awareness. But bird brains lack the layered cortex that mammals have. They achieve similar cognitive results through different neural architecture, suggesting that consciousness doesn't require a specific structure, but rather certain kinds of information processing that can be implemented in different ways. Fish are even more uncertain territory. They respond to stimuli, learn from experience, show behaviors that look like fear or distress when injured. Some species, like cleaner wrasse, might even pass the mirror test, though the interpretation is debated. But are they conscious? Do they feel pain, or just react to noxious stimuli without any subjective feeling? This isn't just an academic question. It has ethical implications for fishing practices, aquaculture, and how we treat the billions of fish killed for food each year. Recent research suggests that at least some fish may indeed feel pain, showing responses that go beyond simple reflexes, including changes in behavior and physiology that indicate distress. They learn to avoid situations that caused pain, show reduced activity and appetite after painful experiences, and their pain responses can be blocked by analgesics, the same pain-relieving drugs that work in mammals. This suggests that the neural machinery for pain, and presumably the conscious experience of pain, may extend far back in evolutionary history. But the question remains contentious, and different researchers interpret the evidence differently. Some argue that without the cortical structures mammals possess, fish can't have conscious pain, only unconscious nociception, the detection and response to harmful stimuli. Others counter that consciousness doesn't require mammalian brains specifically, that fish brains, though different, may support their own kind of awareness. The honest answer is we don't know for certain, and this uncertainty should perhaps make us more rather than less cautious in how we treat these creatures. With insects, the question becomes even harder to resolve. A bee navigates complex environments, communicates with other bees through intricate dances that encode the distance and direction of food sources, makes decisions about where to forage based on cost-benefit calculations. There's sophisticated information processing happening in that tiny brain. But is there experience? Is there something it's like to be a bee? Their nervous systems are so different from ours, so much simpler in terms of neuron count, though remarkably complex in their organization, that many researchers doubt bees are conscious in any meaningful sense. They might be purely reflexive, stimulus-response machines without any inner light of awareness. But we can't be entirely sure. Maybe consciousness comes in degrees, and a bee has just a flicker of awareness, a minimal experience of light and smell and motion, without the richness of human consciousness, but still something rather than nothing. The bee's brain, though containing fewer than 1 million neurons compared to our 86 billion, is capable of remarkable things. Bees can learn and remember, distinguish between different patterns and colors, even understand abstract concepts like sameness and difference. Does all of this happen unconsciously? Or is there a small spark of what it's likeness, a bee's eye view of the world? We may never know unless we can develop better theories of what consciousness requires at a fundamental level. And what about simpler life forms? Worms, jellyfish, bacteria? Most researchers would say these creatures aren't conscious. They respond to their environment, but through relatively simple mechanisms that don't require awareness. There's no one home, so to speak. But drawing a clear line is difficult. Consciousness might emerge gradually as nervous systems become more complex rather than appearing suddenly at some threshold. If so, there might be gray areas, creatures with borderline consciousness, minimal awareness that's hard to characterize or detect. Evolutionary theory suggests consciousness evolved because it provides advantages. Being aware of your environment in a flexible, integrated way allows for more sophisticated responses than hardwired reflexes. You can learn, adapt, plan, imagine alternatives. Consciousness might be evolution's way of creating beings that can deal with complex, unpredictable environments. This implies consciousness wouldn't emerge unless it served a function, which some take as evidence against the idea of consciousness as something separate from physical function. If consciousness is what it does, what it enables an organism to accomplish, then maybe there's no hard problem after all. But others argue that consciousness could be a byproduct, something that comes along with certain kinds of information processing without necessarily providing additional advantages. Maybe any system that integrates information in the right way automatically becomes conscious, whether or not that consciousness serves a purpose. This is part of what makes theories like integrated information theory interesting. They suggest consciousness is a feature of certain organizational patterns, not something evolution specifically selected for. The distribution of consciousness in nature remains deeply uncertain. We know humans are conscious. We're pretty confident mammals are. Birds and possibly some fish and cephalopods like octopuses might be too. Beyond that, we're largely guessing. And this uncertainty reflects our incomplete understanding of consciousness itself. If we don't fully know what consciousness is or what produces it in humans, we can't reliably identify it in other creatures. This has practical consequences. How should we treat animals? If they're conscious, if they feel pain and pleasure, distress and contentment, then we have moral obligations toward them. We shouldn't cause unnecessary suffering. We should consider their welfare. But the extent of those obligations depends on the nature and degree of their consciousness. Questions we can't definitively answer yet. It also has implications for artificial intelligence, which we'll explore more later. If consciousness can exist in very different neural architectures, if birds and mammals both have it despite different brains, then perhaps machines could have it too, implemented in silicon rather than neurons. Or perhaps there's something special about biological systems, something necessary for consciousness that we don't yet understand. The study of consciousness in other animals helps illuminate these questions, showing us the range of possibilities and the limits of our current understanding. As you rest, you share the planet with countless other creatures, many of them likely conscious in various ways and degrees. Each sees the world from its own perspective. Each experiences life according to the structure of its nervous system and the needs of its survival. The universe is full of points of view, centers of experience scattered across species and ecosystems. You're one among many, unique in your humanity but connected to the wider community of conscious beings. That's a humbling and beautiful thought to carry into sleep. Before we turn to the strange landscapes of altered consciousness, let's pause to consider how humans have thought about consciousness throughout history, because our modern scientific approach is just the latest chapter in a very old story. Ancient cultures had their own ways of understanding the mind and awareness. In ancient Egypt, consciousness was thought to reside not in the brain, but in the heart. The heart was the seat of thought, emotion, and personality. When bodies were mummified for the afterlife, the heart was carefully preserved, but the brain was discarded, pulled out through the nose, and thrown away. They had it backward from our current understanding. Yet their emphasis on the heart reflects something real, the intimate connection between emotion, which is deeply tied to the body and particularly to the cardiovascular system, and our sense of self. Ancient Greek philosophers were among the first to seriously grapple with consciousness in ways that feel familiar to modern thought. Plato proposed a dualist view, dividing reality into the world of forms, eternal and perfect, and the material world, transient and flawed. The mind, or soul, in his view, belonged to the realm of forms and was temporarily imprisoned in a physical body. Consciousness was something essentially non-physical, divine, separate from the mere mechanics of flesh and bone. This dualist intuition has been powerfully persistent throughout Western history, the sense that mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of things. Aristotle, Plato's student, took a more naturalistic approach. He saw the soul or psyche as the form of the body, inseparable from it, like the shape is inseparable from the wax that takes that shape. For Aristotle, consciousness wasn't a separate substance, but rather the functioning of a living organism, the activity of being alive and aware. When the body dies, the psyche dies with it, except perhaps for a small divine spark of reason which might be eternal. This view is closer to modern materialism, though of course Aristotle lacked our knowledge of neuroscience and evolution. In medieval Europe, consciousness was understood largely through Christian theology. The soul was immortal, created by God, and would face judgment after death. Consciousness was the domain of the soul, that immaterial essence that made you, you. The great medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas tried to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine, arguing that the soul was the form of the body, but also somehow immortal and capable of existing without the body after death. These theological frameworks shaped how Europeans thought about consciousness for more than 1,000 years. In the East, different traditions developed their own sophisticated understandings. Buddhist philosophy, emerging in India around the 5th century BCE, developed an intricate analysis of consciousness and experience. Buddhism recognizes multiple levels or types of consciousness, from basic sensory awareness to more subtle forms of mental consciousness. Crucially, Buddhism emphasizes the impermanence and constructed nature of consciousness. What we think of as a unified self is actually a stream of momentary mental events, constantly changing, with no fixed essence underneath. This idea that the self is an illusion or construction rather than a fundamental reality remains controversial, but has influenced modern cognitive science and neuroscience. Hindu philosophy, particularly in the traditions of Vedanta, took consciousness as fundamental to reality itself. Brahman, the ultimate reality, is often described as pure consciousness, and individual consciousness is seen as a limited manifestation of this universal awareness. The goal of spiritual practice, in many Hindu traditions, is to realize the identity between individual consciousness and universal consciousness, to wake up from the dream of separation and recognize that awareness itself is the ground of all being. This view treats consciousness not as something that needs to be explained in terms of physical processes, but as the unexplainable foundation from which everything else emerges. Chinese philosophy, particularly Taoism and Confucianism, had less focus on individual consciousness as such, and more on harmony, relationships, and the flow of life energy or qi. But later, Buddhist influence in China led to developments like Chan or Zen Buddhism, which emphasized direct insight into the nature of mind through meditation and paradoxical teaching. The question, what is consciousness, might be answered in Zen with a shout, a gesture, or a seemingly nonsensical phrase, pointing to the limits of conceptual thinking and the importance of direct experience. In the 17th century, the French philosopher René Descartes made consciousness central to Western philosophy in a new way. Facing skeptical doubts about whether anything could be known with certainty, Descartes found one unshakable truth. Even if an evil demon were deceiving him about everything, even if all his perceptions were illusions, he couldn't doubt that he was thinking, that he was conscious. I think, therefore I am, became the foundation for his entire philosophy. Consciousness, the subjective experience of thinking, was the one thing he could know with absolute certainty. But Descartes also crystallized the mind-body problem in its modern form. He argued that mind and body were completely different substances, mind being non-physical and indivisible, body being physical and divisible. This created the puzzle that philosophers are still wrestling with today. How do these two utterly different substances interact? How does a non-physical mind move a physical body? How do physical sensations produce mental experiences? Descartes' own solution, that mind and body interacted through the pineal gland in the brain, was not convincing even to his contemporaries. But the problem he articulated has shaped the discussion ever since. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scientific approaches to consciousness began to emerge. Early psychologists like William James studied consciousness through careful introspection, trying to describe the structure and flow of experience. James famously described consciousness as a stream, not a series of separate moments, but a continuous flow, always changing, yet always connected. He recognized that consciousness has a fringe, vague feelings and relations that surround the clear focus of attention, and he emphasized the personal, subjective nature of experience. The behaviorists who dominated psychology in the early 20th century actually tried to banish consciousness from scientific study altogether. They argued that psychology should only study observable behavior, not unobservable mental states. Consciousness was a private, subjective phenomenon that couldn't be measured objectively, so it had no place in a rigorous science. This behaviorist approach was productive in some ways, leading to important discoveries about learning and behavior. But it also meant that for several decades, consciousness itself was largely ignored in mainstream psychology. The cognitive revolution of the 1950s and 60s brought consciousness back. Psychologists began developing theories of internal mental processes, information processing models that tried to explain how the mind works. Consciousness was reconceived not as some mysterious inner essence, but as one aspect of information processing, the aspect where information becomes available to working memory and can be verbally reported. This more scientific, less mystical approach made consciousness a respectable topic again. Today, consciousness is studied from multiple angles: neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, computer science, even physics, with each discipline contributing its own methods and insights. We're in an era where empirical research and philosophical analysis are in constant dialogue, where brain imaging can inform philosophical arguments, and philosophical clarity can guide scientific research. It's an exciting time, though the fundamental mysteries remain. This historical perspective reminds us that our current scientific approach is not the only way to think about consciousness. Different cultures and eras have emphasized different aspects: the soul, the self, experience, awareness, thought, each capturing something real but perhaps not the whole picture. Maybe a complete understanding will require integrating insights from many traditions, both ancient and modern, recognizing that consciousness is too vast and complex to be captured by any single perspective. Now, let's turn to the strange landscapes of altered consciousness, the states where awareness changes in fundamental ways. Every night, you enter an altered state of consciousness without even trying. Sleep is one of the most familiar yet mysterious changes in awareness. When you sleep, consciousness doesn't simply, turn off like a light switch. It transforms, moving through different stages, sometimes disappearing entirely, sometimes continuing in the strange form we call dreams. In the early stages of sleep, as you're drifting off, consciousness becomes fuzzy and disconnected. Thoughts wander, images float by without logical connection. Awareness of the external world fades. This hypnagogic state, the transition into sleep, can produce vivid hallucinations, sudden jerks as if you're falling, a sense of presence or voices. Your brain is shifting from waking patterns of activity to sleep patterns, and consciousness fragments in the process. Then comes deep sleep, slow-wave sleep where brain activity slows into long, rolling patterns quite different from waking. During this stage, consciousness seems to largely disappear. If you're awakened from deep sleep, you usually report no dreams, no sense of time passing, just a void. You were unconscious in the truest sense, gone from the world of experience. Yet your brain was still active, maintaining your body, processing memories, consolidating what you learned during the day, doing housekeeping tasks that require your conscious mind to be offline. During deep sleep, neurons across your cortex fire in synchronized waves, like a vast ocean of cells rising and falling together. This synchronization is very different from the more chaotic, desynchronized patterns of waking consciousness. It's as if your brain needs this coordinated reset, this unified oscillation, to clear out the metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours, and to strengthen important neural connections while pruning unnecessary ones. Sleep isn't just the absence of consciousness. It's an active state with its own purposes and its own, kind of neural organization. Between periods of deep sleep come lighter stages where consciousness might flicker briefly. Stage 2 sleep is characterized by sleep spindles, brief bursts of rapid brain waves, and K-complexes, sudden high-amplitude waves that researchers still don't fully understand. During these lighter stages, you might have brief, fragmentary dreams or fleeting awareness of the passage of time, though usually these moments are forgotten upon waking. The architecture of sleep is complex, cycling through different stages multiple times each night. Each stage serving different functions and each producing different states of consciousness or unconsciousness. Later in the night comes REM sleep, characterized by rapid eye movements, where most vivid dreaming occurs. Here, consciousness returns, but in a peculiar form. You experience sights, sounds, emotions, narratives, all created entirely by your brain without input from the senses. The external world is blocked out, but your inner world is alive with imagined experiences. You're conscious, but not of reality. You're aware in a dream. Dreams are fascinating because they reveal how much of consciousness is constructed internally. In waking life, it feels like you're directly perceiving the world around you. But dreams show that your brain can generate entire experienced worlds on its own. The vividness, the sense of presence, the conviction that what you're experiencing is real, all of that can exist without any external stimuli. This suggests that even in waking life, consciousness is more like a controlled hallucination than a direct window onto reality. Your brain is always constructing your experience, using sensory input as a guide, but also filling in, predicting, interpreting based on expectations and memories. Anesthesia offers another window into consciousness, or rather, its absence. When anesthetics work properly, they don't just prevent you from remembering what happened or from moving. They eliminate consciousness entirely. You undergo surgery. Hours pass, but you experience nothing. It's different from sleep, where time seems to pass and dreams may occur. Under anesthesia, there is simply a gap. One moment you're counting backward, the next you're waking up, and nothing happened in between from your perspective. Different anesthetics work through different mechanisms, affecting various neurotransmitter systems and brain regions. But they all share the ability to disrupt the patterns of neural activity that support consciousness. Some appear to work by decoupling different brain regions, preventing the integrated communication that's necessary for conscious experience. Others affect specific receptors or ion channels, changing how neurons fire. The fact that consciousness can be reliably turned off by chemicals tells us something important. Consciousness depends on specific, fragile patterns of brain activity. Alter those patterns, and awareness disappears. Then there are disorders of consciousness, tragic conditions that reveal even more about how consciousness works. Someone in a coma is unresponsive, eyes closed, seemingly absent. Their brainstem may keep their body, but the higher brain isn't functioning properly. They're unconscious, with no apparent awareness of themselves or their surroundings. In most cases, comas don't last long, days or weeks, before the person either recovers or progresses to another state. The vegetative state, or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, as it's sometimes called, is more disturbing. People in this state have sleep-wake cycles. Their eyes open, they might move in response to stimuli, but there's no sign of awareness, no purposeful behavior, no communication. From the outside, it's unclear if anyone is home. For years, it was assumed that people in vegetative states were entirely unconscious. But recent studies using brain imaging have complicated that picture. Researchers asked patients in vegetative states to imagine activities like playing tennis or walking through their house while their brains were scanned. In some cases, the brain activity patterns matched those of healthy individuals performing the same mental tasks. This suggests that at least some patients who appear vegetative may actually be conscious, trapped in unresponsive bodies but aware on the inside. These findings have profound ethical implications for treatment decisions and end-of-life care. How do we determine if someone is conscious when they can't communicate? It's a heartbreaking question with no easy answers. Minimally conscious states represent another point on the spectrum, where there are occasional signs of awareness, fleeting moments of response or recognition, but no consistent consciousness. These patients exist in a twilight zone between the unconscious and the fully aware, raising questions about degrees and forms of consciousness we rarely encounter in healthy life. These altered and disordered states teach us that consciousness is not all or nothing. It can be diminished, fragmented, altered in quality. The richness of your normal waking awareness depends on intact neural systems working in coordinated ways. Disrupt those systems through sleep, drugs, or injury, and consciousness changes or disappears. This supports the idea that consciousness emerges from brain activity, that it's something the brain does rather than something independent that merely interacts with the brain. Yet, mysteries remain. Why do we need to sleep at all? If consciousness is metabolically expensive or requires neural maintenance, why not just stay conscious all the time? What functions does sleep serve that can't be accomplished while awake? And why do we dream? What purpose, if any, do those strange nocturnal adventures serve? These questions are still being researched, and the answers aren't entirely clear. As you yourself drift into sleep, your consciousness will soon undergo its nightly transformation. The world will fade and dreams might emerge, your mind playing with itself in the dark. When you wake, hours will have passed, but you might remember only fragments or nothing at all. It's a daily reminder that consciousness is not a permanent, unchanging light, but something dynamic, something that comes and goes, transforms and returns, a wave that rises and falls with the rhythms of your brain and body. In these altered states, you glimpse the flexibility and fragility of awareness. Consciousness is not a given, but an achievement, something your brain maintains through constant effort. And when that effort is interrupted by sleep or anesthesia or injury, consciousness can slip away as easily as a dream forgotten upon waking. Now, as we near the end of our journey through consciousness, let's peer forward into the future and ask whether machines might one day share this mysterious inner light. Can artificial intelligence be conscious? It's a question that sounds like science fiction, but is becoming increasingly relevant as AI systems grow more sophisticated. Already, we have machines that can recognize faces, translate languages, play games at superhuman levels, even generate art and music. They process information, learn from experience, and respond to their environment. But are they conscious? Do they experience anything? Or are they just very advanced automatons? Zombies in the philosophical sense? The question is harder than you might think. We can't just ask an AI if it's conscious because passing the Turing test, convincing us it's conscious through conversation, doesn't prove it actually is. A sufficiently advanced chatbot could be programmed to claim consciousness, to describe inner experiences, without actually having any. Remember, a philosophical zombie, by definition, would speak about consciousness just like a conscious being does, despite having no inner experience. Some argue that if an AI functions like a conscious being, processes information the way our brains do, then it is conscious. Consciousness is what brains do, and if we replicate that function in silicon, we replicate consciousness. This is a functionalist position, the view that consciousness depends on what a system does, not what it's made of. If an AI integrates information, models itself and its environment, responds flexibly to new situations, has something like attention and memory, then perhaps there's something it's like to be that AI. Others insist that biological substrates matter, that consciousness requires organic neurons, not transistors and circuits. Maybe there's something about the electrochemical processes in neurons, something about the way biological systems are organized that's essential for consciousness. In that case, no matter how intelligent an AI becomes, it would remain a zombie, processing without experiencing. We can't rule this out because we don't know what gives rise to consciousness in biological systems, so we can't be sure whether those same properties can be implemented in artificial systems. Integrated information theory, mentioned earlier, suggests consciousness depends on how integrated and differentiated information is in a system, not on the physical substrate. By this account, a sufficiently complex AI with the right kind of information integration could be conscious. The theory even attempts to quantify consciousness with its measure phi, which in principle could be calculated for artificial systems. But calculating phi for large systems is currently impractical, and the theory's predictions about what counts as conscious are sometimes counterintuitive, leading to ongoing debates about its validity. There's also the question of what kind of consciousness an AI might have. Human consciousness is shaped by our evolutionary history, our embodiment in physical bodies with needs and emotions, our social nature. We experience hunger, pain, pleasure, fear, love, all tied to our biology and our relationships with others. An AI that lacks a body, lacks survival needs, lacks emotions rooted in biology, might have a very different kind of consciousness, if it has any at all. It might be aware of patterns in data, of its own processing states, in ways we can't imagine, creating experiences utterly alien to us. This raises ethical concerns. If we create conscious AI, we would have moral obligations toward them. Conscious beings can suffer, can have interests that matter from their own perspective. We shouldn't cause unnecessary suffering or treat conscious entities merely as tools. But how do we determine if an AI is conscious? We can't rely on behavior alone, since behavior could be mimicked. We can't rely on self-reports, since those could be programmed. We need a theory of consciousness solid enough to tell us what conditions are sufficient for experience, and we don't have that yet. Some researchers are working on building ethical frameworks for dealing with potentially conscious AI, even though we're uncertain whether current or near-future systems are conscious. Better safe than sorry, they argue. If there's even a chance an AI is conscious, we should treat it with moral consideration until we know for sure. Others think this is premature, that worrying about AI consciousness distracts from more immediate concerns about AI safety, bias, and misuse. There's also the possibility of creating AI that's designed to be conscious, not just intelligent. If we understood what gives rise to consciousness, we could potentially engineer it into machines on purpose. This would be a momentous development, the creation of new kinds of minds, new centers of experience. It would expand the realm of consciousness beyond biology for the first time in the history of the universe, as far as we know. The implications, philosophical, ethical, and practical, are staggering. But we're not there yet. We don't know if current AI systems, even very advanced ones, have any glimmer of awareness. We don't know what we would need to add to make them conscious, or whether it's even possible. The hard problem of consciousness looms large here, too. We can build systems that mimic conscious behavior, but does that create consciousness, or just the appearance of it? Until we solve the hard problem, until we understand how physical processes give rise to experience, we can't confidently create conscious machines or rule out the possibility that we already have. As artificial intelligence continues to advance, these questions will become more pressing. We might find ourselves sharing the world with machines that seem conscious, that claim to be conscious, that in every functional way are conscious, yet we're uncertain whether there's really someone there or just an illusion of presence. How we answer these questions will shape the future of technology, ethics, and our understanding of our own minds. For now, you're almost certainly the only conscious being in your room as you drift toward sleep, the only center of experience in your immediate vicinity. But in decades to come, that might change. The mystery of consciousness, currently confined to biological brains, might expand into new territories carried forward by beings we create rather than evolve. And whether that's a glorious expansion of mind into new realms or a kind of hubris, playing with forces we don't understand, depends on how much we learn before we get there. We've traveled far together tonight, from the basic question of what consciousness is, through the hard problem that stumps philosophers and scientists, into the neural machinery that seems to produce awareness, across the spectrum of consciousness in nature, through altered states and disorders, and finally into questions about artificial minds. At every turn, we've found mystery wrapped in wonder, knowledge mixed with uncertainty. Here's what we know. Consciousness exists, undeniably, intimately. You know you're conscious because you're experiencing these words, this moment, the weight of your body and the thoughts in your mind. That direct acquaintance with your own awareness is the most certain thing you can know. Descartes got at least that right, I think, therefore I am. Even if everything else is illusion, the fact that you're experiencing something is unquestionable. We also know that consciousness depends on the brain. When the brain is damaged, consciousness changes or disappears. When brain chemistry is altered, awareness shifts. The tight correlation between neural activity and conscious experience is overwhelming. Even if we don't understand how neurons give rise to qualia, we know they're intimately connected. Your consciousness is tied to 3 pounds of tissue in your skull, a biological organ that somehow becomes a theater of subjective experience. Science has made real progress. We've identified many of the brain regions involved in consciousness, traced some of the neural pathways, discovered that consciousness involves integration across multiple areas, feedback between higher and lower processing, certain patterns of synchronized activity. We've developed theories, testable frameworks that generate predictions and guide research. We're not entirely in the dark. But the deepest question remains unanswered. Why is there something it's like to be you? Why aren't you a zombie, processing information in the dark without any inner light? How do physical processes, atoms and molecules following the laws of physics, become feelings and experiences, and that peculiar sense of being someone. The hard problem stands, not as a wall that can never be climbed, perhaps, but as a mountain whose peak we haven't yet reached. Some think we'll solve it eventually, that the hard problem will dissolve as neuroscience advances and our concepts become more sophisticated. We'll look back and wonder what all the fuss was about, just as we no longer find it mysterious that living things are made of the same atoms as non-living things. The seeming gap between matter and mind will turn out to be a gap in our understanding, not a fundamental divide in nature. Others believe consciousness points to something genuinely new in the universe, something that can't be reduced to physics and chemistry as currently understood. Maybe consciousness is fundamental, a basic feature of reality that we'll need to incorporate into our scientific theories rather than explain away. Maybe a complete understanding of the universe requires both objective descriptions and subjective perspectives, third-person science and first-person experience, integrated in ways we haven't yet imagined. Either way, consciousness matters. It's not just an academic puzzle, but the very substance of your life. Everything you value, every joy and sorrow, every moment of beauty or meaning, happens within consciousness. Without awareness, there would be no one to care about anything, no purposes or values, no sense that life is worth living. Consciousness is the light that makes existence more than just mechanical process. It's what makes you more than just a complicated machine. As you lie here, perhaps on the edge of sleep now, perhaps drifting in that strange hypnagogic state where consciousness starts to fragment and dreams begin to seep in, you're participating in the mystery. You don't need to solve it. You don't need to understand how your brain creates your experience. It's enough to simply be, to rest in awareness, to appreciate the strange gift of existing as a conscious being in an ancient universe. The atoms in your body were forged in stars billions of years ago, scattered into space, gathered into new structures eventually becoming you. And somehow, those atoms organized just right, in the intricate patterns of your brain, have become aware. They've turned into someone who can think and feel and wonder. That's astonishing, whether we can explain it or not. So let consciousness be mysterious. Let it be the one puzzle we don't solve tonight, the question we carry forward into tomorrow and beyond. What matters is not always having answers, but being present with the questions. Living fully in the awareness we have even as we seek to understand it. Thank you for spending this time exploring consciousness with me. If these gentle journeys into deep questions bring you peace or spark your curiosity, I'd love it if you'd like this video and subscribe to Sleepy Answers. It helps others find these quiet explorations too. And remember, every time you wake up, you are stepping back into the mystery, returning to consciousness after its nightly disappearance. That daily miracle is worth appreciating. For now, let yourself drift. Let sleep take you where it will. And when you wake, the mystery will be there waiting, as close as your next thought, as intimate as your next sensation, the eternal puzzle of what it means to be conscious, to be you, here and now, in this vast, strange, beautiful universe. Sleep well, dream softly, and wake renewed to the wonder of awareness.